Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fast Pass, the history podcast in close to 30 minutes or less. As always, I'm Trevor.
Jason.
And I'm Megan.
And today we're talking about the Black Death, also known as the Black Plague. Now, we're starting off with the first wave of the Black Plague, the one that you kind of know of, which happened from 1347 to 1351, with many smaller instances happening throughout the later 1300s into the early 1400s. They're often kind of grouped together because of how similar they were, where it affected, how people responded. And it all started on the Silk Road, headed from Central Asia to Europe as well as parts of Northern Africa. But what exactly is the Black Death, or Black Plague? Well, it's a disease that would cause such symptoms as high fever and chills, pains in the abdomen, arms and legs, blackened tissue from necrosis, vomiting, and profuse bleeding. If you got this, you're basically going to die within 5 days to a week. It's a nasty thing that can still happen to some people in the modern day. There are about 7 cases of Black Death in the US each year. So a wild world history event that is also kind of relevant today.
So let's go back to when it all started with the stuff you probably know. The first wave of the Black Death killed somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of Europe. The numbers are quite varied since census numbers weren't really a thing, so estimates of populations are compared to claims about the number of people surviving in a town. One main source during the Black Death were monks who lived in monasteries that were fairly separated from major towns. They wrote about what they saw and sometimes assumed an entire town was dead, just because they didn't see anybody walking the streets. Which I get not wanting to go near an infected town, but maybe just a little bit more effort. We know a lot of people died, but the exact number is hard to pin down due to the inaccurate numbers of total population as well as the number dead. Those who remained typically had built up or naturally had a resistance to the plague, which made future waves of the plague less impactful, but still important enough for us to talk about here.
So what did the people in the 1300s think was going on and what was causing it? With modern science, we know that everything was caused by infected fleas biting people, and that the plague spread so far due to the fleas hopping to rats who travel on boats, which caused the small outbreak in Asia to spread over most of Europe and even a bit of Africa. Obviously, the people back then didn't know that, so they assumed quite a few different things. Whenever there was something people didn't understand back in the day, their go-to was that this must be God's punishment. God was mad at some aspect of their life and chose mass murder as the way to show his disapproval and get people to repent. This didn't last long due to the fact that priests would also get sick, which doesn't make sense if God was the one causing all of this. A lot of people turned toward religion and then quickly away from religion as the waves progressed.
So, if it wasn't God causing this, then it must be something environmental. Now, some of the villages assumed that the tanneries were the cause because they're releasing bad stuff into the water that was given the plague. Well, drinking from the same sources where the tanneries are dumping its waste products was probably giving people some illnesses, but it wasn't the plague. Still, many people who worked in these tanneries were kicked out of town. Some were allowed to continue working just far enough away from the town so that the water wouldn't be infected. Others were forced entirely to stop.
Finally, and most idiotically, was Pope Gregory IX's crusade against cats. He believed that they carried Satan's spirit and were the source of the plague. The issue is that cats were one of the things keeping the plague at bay. Since the plague was carried by fleas that hopped onto rats, cats were often kept on ships to catch any of these rats. Without them, the rat population and therefore the flea population boomed and spread the plague much faster and farther than before. Also, all the anti-cat stuff, with them being the embodiment of Satan, also led to a witch hunt where even more cats were killed since they were thought to be witches' familiars. So from around the late 1200s to early 1400s, there were repeated mass killings of cats. Some of these ideas about the causes of the plague were from a less technological time, trying to make sense of this disease, but some of these ideas were just plain dumb. And that covers the first major wave, and the one that is often taught in schools.
Now we move on to the stuff that isn't talked about as much or is sometimes lumped in with the first wave. The second major wave of the Black Death happened between the mid-1400s and the mid-1600s. This still resulted in hundreds of thousands to millions of deaths, but even though it was a smaller outbreak, close to 5% of the population died. That's still major, but nowhere near the 1/3 to 2/3 of the population that died in the first wave.
One of the most notable events during the second wave was the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed a record 68,000 people, but was estimated to have killed at least 100,000. This is about 15% of the town's population in less than a year. It's believed that the main reason why the plague lasted so little time was due to the Great London Fire of 1666, which burned down a large amount of housing in the towns, which likely killed many of the rats and fleas that were spreading the disease. The people learned from the past and realized that, hey, praying to God wasn't going to stop the plague, and the tanneries probably weren't the cause of the Black Plague. So as waves continued, we got more ideas and more possible solutions to the Black Death. The one most people know and associate with the Black Death are the plague doctors. Now, their iconic look that we know of today is not how they originally looked. It looked a lot weirder and uglier. How would you describe it?
The nose is 1/2 foot long, shaped like a beak, filled with perfume with only 2 holes, one on each side near the nostrils, but that can suffice to breathe and carry along with the air one breathes the impression of the herbs enclosed further along the beak. Under the waxed coat we wear boots made of Moroccan leather, goat leather, from the front of the breeches in smooth skin that are attached to said boots, and a short-sleeved blouse in smooth skin, the bottom of which is tucked into the breeches. The hat and gloves are also made of the same skin, with spectacles over the eyes. Charles Delorme, French physician who came up with the design around 1630.
Basically, they thought it was the bad air that was causing the plague, so the goal was to kind of make the outfit airtight, or as close as they could get to that, with some nice-smelling flowers in front of the only place air could get in. And this actually was pretty effective at stopping the plague, but not for the reason they thought. The top-to-bottom coverage of skin helped deter the infected fleas, which kept them safe. The plague doctors were often not actual doctors, but either doctor apprentices or even some with no medical training, since they were actually willing to interact with plague victims. They provided whatever medical aid they could, as well as keeping records of deaths, performing autopsies, and keeping journals to help with the treatments and preventative measures.
Now on to the less scientific side of the plague, is the rise of the flagellants. This is a religious group that formed around the 1260s, but became much bigger in the 14 and 1500s. Flagellants were still very religious, but took a different view compared to the first wave of Black Death. Flagellants believed that they had to inflict physical harm to themselves to appease God and stop the plague. This religious group thrived where others failed, since their cause was much more vague and focused on the group rather than the individual, since the individual would fall apart as soon as a religious figure died. The group aspect of the flagellants meant that if anyone in the group died, it's because the collective hasn't done enough harm to themselves. This caused them to thrive in the different waves of the plague in the 1500s.
Finally, we have the final major wave of the plague, which happened around the 1800s and 1900s. At this point, it had more or less stopped in Europe and Africa, but still occurred in Asia and even spread to Australia and the United States briefly. Now, these are mostly less lethal and also less interesting as we are reaching the modern day with modern medicine. Asia was hit the hardest during this time, who around the 1850s had 10 million die in India, with many more in other countries like China. That is the last of the major outbreaks, but the Black Death did proceed to Australia from 1900 to 1925, which resulted in over 1,000 deaths. This outbreak did help with the discovery of the cause of the Black Death being caused by the fleas. There was also an outbreak in San Francisco from 1900 to 1904, which was interesting because for the first 2 years, the governor, Henry Gage, essentially tried to cover up the outbreak. A quarantine was placed in 1900, but the governor persuaded the federal government to just lift the quarantine. Yeah, but by 1902, the outbreak began to become a national threat, and the quarantine was reinstated, and a large amount of funding was being devoted to researching and curing the disease. This was the last major instance of the Black Death occurring, but it still pops up all around the world, but in far fewer instances, with a far lower mortality rate.
And the rest is history. Thank you all for listening. All of the sources will be in the description box. Make sure to listen next week for our After the Pod to get our opinions on all the weird stuff about the Black Plague. And until next time.
Bye-bye.